think for that job, they get paid a little bit of money, and then on top of that, they're charged for the cost of the van that takes them to the workplace. They're charged for the uniform that they have to wear. So it's sort of like they're kind of fees and fines that knock everything down to almost nothing. And in a lot of cases, the $2 a day is a lot. They're required to do lots of work unpaid in the prisons. They do all the construction. You could see that even the drug dorm, where the counselor decided to leave his job. There was a professional drug counselor in one of the prisons, and nobody replaces him. And so Raoul Poole, one of the guys in our film, just starts running the drug dorm. And that's a drug dorm that's getting money from the federal government to pay for drug treatment program in prison. And that money's just not going anywhere, or money's just going into the coffers of whoever's running the prison system.
God. And is there any accountability for all the money? Do they do an audit of the money? Or is it just...
There really is not any meaningful accountability. There's like the state auditor who we actually interviewed and spent a lot of time with, just sort of threw up his hands. He said, there's just no way for me to keep track of this money. And, for example, they got this incredibly horrible set of findings from the Justice Department, right? The DOJ went into the Alabama state prison system and did an investigation because, for reasons I can explain that are kind of incredible. But anyway, they went in there and they investigated the whole prison system, which I think they'd never done before. Usually they investigate an individual prison or something like that. And they went in and issued a report that said, this is beyond the pale. There are horrific things that are happening in your prisons, people being murdered, and there's the highest rate of drug overdose and highest rate of rape. And Alabama's response was to say, well, we think that's just anecdotal and you don't know what you're talking about. And then they decided that their solution, the Alabama solution that we sort of ironically talk about in the title of the film, the one the governor talks about, is just to build new prisons. And meantime, the DOJ did not say to build any new prisons. The DOJ said your problem is with corruption and brutality, and you're operating really a criminal enterprise, and therefore you need to address the underlying problems. And Alabama's response was, well, the DOJ says the prisons are no good, so we got to build new ones. Well,
so they get a massive contract.
Yeah, exactly. So we always call it the Alabama Department of Construction, because they don't really change anything unless they have the opportunity to build something. And that's really good for all the governor's supporters and all the other people who are, in the construction industry. And, they've now started construction on these massive new prisons. Alabama's a tiny state. It's like, smaller population, I think, than Norway. And they've got a tiny budget, and yet they figure out how to put together a multi-billion-dollar prison construction plan. They can't fund it at first. The governor announces she's going to build these new prisons, which the DOJ did not ask for, and are not going to solve the problem. And they admit, by the way, that they're not going to affect overcrowding, which is a huge problem. The prisons are operating at like 200% capacity. And, when they're asked about it, the head of the Department of Corrections, they ask him, is this going to affect the overcrowding, or is it just the same number of beds? And he goes, no, it's the same number of beds. It's not going to affect overcrowding. So they're building these massive new facilities.